teaching, excellent teaching, and indeed making sure that we have got systems in place that allow for that connection. But I think also to that, the third part of the importance of this discussion is how quickly has the system moved as well in supporting digital learning and in deep learning. Because if the system doesn't move in progressing assessment, in progressing qualifications, in reimagining what schooling could look like, then sadly, I think that will be an anchor around our necks, and we will revert back to the status quo of that post-industrial age. So I'll stop talking. I hope I've given some food for thought in that. Thank you.
Ethne, thank you. That was great. And a lot of interesting issues that you raised that I might want to return to in the question session. But I'm now going to turn to Karen Bramwell, the CEO of the Forward as One Academy Trust. Karen, over to you.
Thanks, David. I'm going to come at this at a bit of a more practical level, looking at our journey with digital learning and our strategy that we've developed over COVID. So at Forward as One, we're a trust of, we're currently 8, soon to be 9 schools across 3 different local authorities in the Northwest. One of which is Bolton, which is, as you can tell from my accent, which is COVID central, as everybody knows. So our Bolton schools in particular have been really, really hard hit. And some of our schools have had a worse time rather than just the lockdown period. It's the autumn term, really, where they've been in and they've been out and nobody's really known where they were up to. In some classes have been disproportionately affected by COVID, and we've worked out the number of lost learning days, and it's an incredibly disparate picture across the piece, because we've got schools of high deprivation and schools with what you would class as a leafy green. So at Forward as One, we use our national support school as what we call a laboratory school. So when we're trying something new, we pilot it at our laboratory school. And the demographic of that school is inner urban, multicultural in Bolton. It's quintile 1 for EAL and it's quintile 2 for deprivation. And we've always prided ourselves at this school on the fact that our pupil premium children have outperformed national at Key Stage 2. But in 2019, the data had started to dip. So on analysis, the performance of the children with the high needs that have adversely affected this, particularly those with EHCPs. But nevertheless, we are determined to eliminate the gap. The schools used metacognition, collaborative learning, whole class reading comprehension approaches alongside some use of EdTech, but we decided that we needed to go deeper. So we piloted a one-to-one device strategy to reduce that digital divide and provide greater access to personalisation, particularly using EdTech to address and remove those barriers to learning that are particular for certain children. So we also needed to deepen e-safety. And that was really, really important to us alongside digital literacy, because we felt that it was really important for us to empower our children to prepare for Key Stage 3. But I'm also an Ofsted inspector, and I've seen lots of lessons that have been ruined, quite frankly, by the use of EdTech because it looks great, but actually it hasn't delivered the learning that's required in that lesson. So EdTech to be used when it's the most effective way, not just because it's there. And along came COVID following this. And our data showed that 40% of families in some of our schools had access to a device which was not a smartphone. 55-60% in most of our schools had families that were underconfident in supporting learning in any way, remote or paper-based. And staff in the schools, apart from the one where we'd piloted the EdTech, were really underconfident. The technology, unlike in Wales, was completely unsuitable, out of date, And in one of our schools that we'd sponsored, they had a set of 12-year-old fizz books, and none of the computers had Microsoft software that was currently supported by Microsoft. Not a good position. They did have nice interactive boards, but nothing really to work them properly with. So we also had an issue where there was poor broadband and poor Wi-Fi. So it needed some significant investment. And a key thing that we also found was that children in families where very little English was spoken, they had far less exposure to a quality model of spoken English. And that was an issue. So our return data showed that the one-to-one device strategy that we piloted had positively impact on progress and attainment in our school that had the highest number of children within English as an additional language, and quite a high level of deprivation. So staff at that school were really quite confident in delivering remote learning. So we therefore used the various strategies. We pulled it all together: the COVID catch-up, the EdTech demonstrator programme from the DFE, and ULT have been absolutely wonderful in working with us, and investing in a trust-wide platform for CPD for staff and communication for staff across the trust, across 3 local authorities. And we used that to implement our strategy. So what we decided was that as a group of heads, we would put one-to-one device strategy in for all schools across Key Stage 2. However, the learning in the laboratory school was key to this, because what needed to be in place, and we needed a financial plan in place to support a really robust rolling programme to ensure that teacher devices, classroom devices and pupil devices are kept up to date and safe. Some of those devices in the schools weren't up to date enough to have decent secure software on them. The broadband and Wi-Fi in the schools and home, it has to work, and we had to provide a lot of dongles to families who did not have access to data, only on a pay-as-you-go mobile phone contract, which obviously, I mean, this is where the divide is, isn't it? So we put in place also robust security and online safety, because the last thing you want to do is put devices in the hands of children and families who haven't got digital literacy and will not know how to keep themselves safe online. So we're doing that for them. So our secure system goes with the device to the home and monitors keystrokes. But key to everything was a professional development programme about the excellent use of EdTech to support quality learning is a CPD entitlement. So we've trained every member of staff in how to do that, including teaching assistants. Well, that's an ongoing programme. Within our trust, we have a CPD entitlement model. So everybody is entitled to a certain level of CPD, and we've identified the toolkit that a teacher needs or a teaching assistant needs to be able to teach. And the use of technology needs to now be part of that toolkit on a rolling programme. And what we've done is we've ensured that our metacognitive learning and our knowledge of the science of learning and memory are embedded in our teaching, whether using technology or not, so that use of technology in the classroom empowers the children to learn at home remotely, and that it's used to make sure that peers can interact collaboratively, because we know that collaborative learning has a positive impact on pupil attainment. So we need to build that into our use of EdTech and teach our teachers how to do that properly. So we've used our platform so that teachers in one local authority can drop in and observe the lesson of a peer teacher to learn from them, and that offer is reciprocal. It's been really, really powerful, and it's allowing us to further embed that flipped and blended learning approach as part of our everyday practice, so that our children are much more confident in their use of it. So when they take their device home, they know what they're doing. And that use of those adaptive, personalised learning programmes has been really key to this. It's been a joy to see lessons where you've got an international new arrival in a class learning their phonics with their headphones, while you've got other children tackling quite a difficult task for comprehension with an online book, all using their technology to meet their needs and make sure that they can get up to the right standard. And to break down those barriers between home and school and improve communication. We have a lot of families who've had a bad experience of school, and actually we've had greater engagement with parents' evenings, like a lot of people have, and our learn alongside lessons, they can now do that remotely. And that's quite exciting for us. We need to empower them so that they're not underconfident in supporting their children at home. And it's about, for us, using that personalisation of learning to provide that access to ignite creativity in our children, but also in our staff through that innovative use of technology and that peer-to-peer collaboration at child level, but also at teacher level.
Karen, that was really interesting. Thank you very much. And I've got lots of questions myself about some of the things you've been doing in your school, which we will come back to, but thank you for that. I'm now going to come to Dr. Nikos Savvas, the CEO of the Suffolk Academies Trust. Nikos.
Hi, and thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Let me give you first of all an overview of the context of where we were operating. We're operating across 4 counties, rural counties. We have 7,016 to 18s, which ranges from highly academic subjects to creating and preparing the future Michelin star chefs, and about 7,019 plus students. We work with thousands of businesses every year. We're also an ed tech lead. So when the pandemic started, we thought, well, you know, we better up our game here. We already had an existing team of practitioners that they were leading on ed tech. But what we wanted to do to start with was take stock, because it is so much more than devices. In a rural county, quite a lot of our students, first of all, can't have access to internet. They don't have access to internet. They don't have access to phones. So we needed to be able to, for them to be able to get a signal to start with. Quite a lot of this generation, we assume that they're digital natives. They're digital natives only on specific applications. They're not the digital natives that we think they are. And of course, we have a lot of staff that they were phobic of, and they were practitioners that they have honed their skills for years on personal interactions in the classroom, engaging with students on one-to-one. And we took that from underneath their feet overnight. So what we tried to do is, once we understood the magnitude of the problem, put the right implementations in place to make sure that all the students had access and the staff had access, we turned it around on its head. We had an enhanced team of digital practitioners with a steering group, and we tried to create a whole curriculum that it is going to based not just on functionality. It needed to be exciting, both for the staff and the students. We created an experimentation digital playroom where staff could come in together, practice without fear or loathing anything new that we were throwing at them. And in the meantime, we started working across subjects and across campuses to share the best practice. We didn't choose one particular platform. mainly because our students and our staff had access to a variety of devices, and because we are looking at what the students are going to do after they finish with us. Remember, we are the step before university and before going into the world of work. So we needed to prepare the students for what the world of work would have to throw at them. So we used a number of different applications, a number of different platforms, and we tailored it to the specific subject, to the specific industry. And what we decided to do is turn it on its head in the essence of, I mean, our students have, it is very difficult for them to get access to high caliber speakers that would exist in bigger conurbations. In order for us to be able to see a number of people who are the best of their field, we either need to bring them to Suffolk or to Cambridge, or we need to travel to London or to Manchester. Because the entire world had to be forced to go online, and they needed to learn all of a sudden the entire world, not just Britain, was opened to us and our students. And we started bringing speakers from multinational businesses. We started bringing speakers from renowned institutions in the UK, in Australia, in Switzerland. And we were able to do that pretty much overnight. We took that then where we created events like STEMtastic, where we had 100 speakers. And we opened that not just to our students, but we opened that to all the schools, primaries and secondaries we were working with. So where do we go from that? Well, for me, this is a unique opportunity. This is a unique opportunity to raise aspirations and not just deliver curriculum. This is a unique opportunity to open what businesses look like, what other educational institutions look like, to our students and to our staff. And we intend to grasp this with both hands, and we would love to be able to collaborate with a number of the people who are currently on the panel and beyond. Thank you.
Nikos, thank you very much indeed. And I'll pick up a couple of those really interesting points you raised with you in a moment, if I may. I'm now going to come to our fourth speaker on this panel, Julia Patrick, the Chief Executive of the Apollo Partnerships Trust. Julia, thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Hello everybody, and again, thank you for inviting me this afternoon. If I just give you a little bit of context about our trust. We're a fairly small trust in Northwest Leicestershire currently, of just under 3,000 students. We've got 3 schools, fairly large primary school, obviously starting with early years, and 2 secondary schools. One is 11 to 16 and one's 11 to 19. This time last year, we actually had 4 schools, but we merged 2 of them during the pandemic, which was wonderful, and made one 11 to 19 school and one 11 to 16. So for some of our staff, some of them hadn't taught Key Stage 4, some of them hadn't taught Key Stage 3, and then were thrown into the pandemic and digital learning. But I'm not going to talk about that now. I'm going to talk about beyond COVID and the work that we're planning to do beyond that. Because I think, as Ethne said in her presentation, is this enough? Are we offering enough? And how are we going to continue to do this? And as Nikos said, we've got a unique opportunity now. And let's make sure that we get things right as we move forward. So I'm just going to talk for a short time about our trust and how we're going to develop things as we move forward post-COVID, which now I believe doesn't finish on the 21st of June. It's not going to end, is it, for another 4 weeks, and then it will be gone. So post-COVID, we had actually employed a director of IT across the trust just before lockdown, actually. So it's quite a godsend, and unwittingly employed the colleague. And his role was very much to look at how we deliver the teaching of IT, how we use IT, how we use digital learning, how we deliver that teaching across all aspects of the curriculum, right from early years through to post-16. And as we move forward now, his role is very much encompassed around how we push forward the developments that were brought to us probably much sooner than we'd anticipated. So we'd already started to put a plan together of our use of digital technology. And my colleague's role has, as I said, been a godsend over the last year, but also is really driving forward the legacy that will be, well, as we move on away from COVID. We've made this aspect very much part of our trust improvement plan as we drive forward. And we've been very careful in our approach. So just as Karen was talking about, you know, we need to ensure that we use this in the most effective way, and we don't use technology just because it's there. And yes, it has made a huge difference to parents' evenings, where we've now, you know, after 5 minutes, thank you very much, and let's see the next parent. And it's been fantastic in some areas. We want to make sure that we don't have a gun-ho approach, that we don't just say, right, this has been fantastic in the work that we've done this year, but we really want to plan the work that we're doing over the next few years. So within our trust, we've done a SWOT analysis of where we are now across the curriculum, right from early years through to post-16, what works well, how we could improve aspects of it. And we're also really focusing on curriculum design. So we want to make sure that we build upon our skills, and we have a really clear pathway of how the pupils in the primary schools and the secondary students move forward. And for us, it's really important that we dovetail learning so that key stages are moving forward. We've noticed there's quite a difference generally between moving from key stage 2 to key stage 3, and this is something that we've focused on across the trust in lots of subjects, but particularly in this aspect now. So we really are developing digital problem solvers. One of our schools has already the one-to-one devices, and we do use the Apple iPads, and this is something that we plan to do pre-COVID with all of our students. And this again is something that we'll be bringing in post-COVID. One of the school that has got the Apple iPads, we've found that in some aspects it hasn't worked quite as well as we thought, because there hasn't been that real planned continuous professional development. So this is something that as a trust and as the director of IT of the digital learning across the trust is ensuring that we've got bite-sized chunks of 5 minutes CPD for staff, that we're going to be using the Apple training scheme, that we've got in-house training, that we're revisiting constantly that training, so that staff are always have access and a fully follow kind of the training that we produce, so that students aren't left behind, and equally staff aren't left behind. We've also dedicated curriculum time to computing lessons in Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. And we're fortunate that we've got a very large Amazon base near us. So we've had links, we developed links with them as well. We've also found that one of the things that we really need to do with this extra digital capabilities that we've now got is employ more technicians. So we've used our apprenticeship levy to do that. And that's meant that we've got technicians that are with us that perhaps we wouldn't have been able to do as a trust prior to that. So I think the thing for me is with developing a very simple, very clear plan of developing the skills of staff to enable us to build the skills of students. And I was really interested to listen to Karen particularly, and perhaps link with Karen in the future, because it seems that we've got a very similar vision as we move forward. But for us, that clear plan, developing skills, moving forward, developing that one-to-one devices for all of our students, so that no student is left behind, And we, again, as Nikos said, we've got this unique opportunity. Let's use it in the best way we possibly can.
Julia, thank you very much for that. Again, lots of really interesting practical stuff from your schools, which I'd like to come back to in a moment. But our final panelist, before we open up to questions, is Kat Scutt, the Director of Education and Research at the Chartered College of Teaching. Kat, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, David. The danger always of being last on a panel, of course, is that everybody else has already said everything that I might have wanted to say, and in such an articulate way too. But I'll try to add a few additional thoughts to the experiences that have been shared from school-based colleagues. First of all, I suppose one thing that has really struck me over the past few months is that I think we've moved a little bit away from what used to be the case in terms of technology use with teachers, where you had on the one hand the kind of ICT evangelists who like to imagine this kind of digital nirvana where all teaching could be done online, and you didn't need schools in their current form anymore, and the classroom's walls weren't kind of boundaries in the ways that they'd previously been. And then on the other hand, you had the skeptics for certainly kind of a politest way to describe them, I suppose, who would say, actually, all of this focus on technology, all of this focus on digital shiny devices, is it actually helping? Is it making things worse? We know that actually a huge amount of money has been invested over many years, in some countries in particular, on digital technology without noticeably seeing a sort of related increase in student attainment. So I think historically we used to see that real kind of tension between those. And what I think we've seen over the last year, 18 months, is actually a sort of convergence of those in some ways. Those who were previously the evangelists have kind of seen, actually, yes, there are things that work well about technology, but also an awful lot is lost when we move away from the face-to-face. There are some things that actually face-to-face learning is much better for. And I think there's much more hesitance now about this idea that we could move to this much more digitally enabled online teaching approach. And on the other side of that, those who perhaps were more skeptical have seen that obviously in the current context, it's been very necessary to use technology, but that actually they've discovered some things do work quite well. And there are ways that digital tools can be used to support teaching and learning. So for me, it's actually brought us to a point where we can have much more productive conversations about technology use that are less polarized, and that really mean that we can start to think about how we use technology most effectively, rather than the debate being, do we use technology or not? So coming specifically to the question I wanted to address really was this one of how schools can develop the digital skills of their teachers and pupils. And an important point for me is that that sometimes we sort of almost think about those things in isolation. We think, great, we need to develop our teachers' digital skills, obviously, and we want to develop our pupils' digital skills. But interestingly, we've been doing some research over the last few weeks for UNESCO, just a literature review, looking at exactly these kinds of questions. And one of the things that's quite interesting, if you look at the frameworks for teachers' digital competencies around the world, there are lots of different ones. There's lots of crossover in what those cover, typically areas around teacher technological competence, their knowledge of digital pedagogies, but actually an area that is not covered in a great deal of depth at all is this explicit point of how do teachers develop pupils' digital skills. They're almost kind of seen as two separate things. And yet, of course, the ways that pupils will develop their digital skills is through the training and support that they get from teachers. So I think that's one area that we need to focus on going forwards. I think historically there was sometimes a bit of a misplaced assumption that because these pupils are digital natives, for want of a better term, they've grown up with technology, maybe they don't need to be taught explicitly the sort of digital skills. They know how to use devices. We moan all the time about children being on their phones all the time, but of course what we've seen again over the last year, but even before that, is that doesn't necessarily mean they have the skills to use technology effectively, and specifically effectively for learning. There's all sorts of evidence that, for example, they can struggle with knowing how to make effective use of search engines, even how to be critical about the sorts of resources they choose. So thinking about things like that is important, but also things like actually the basics like reading and note-taking on screen. There's some really interesting research that suggests that we do read slightly differently when we're reading on screen versus in print. We tend to skim and read much quicker online versus in print. But an important point actually that comes out of that same research is that that's not it's not inherent to the media. We can teach people to do things differently. if you concentrate, you can make sure you read things more fully online. And sometimes actually, if what you want is to read something very quickly and get the gist, reading online might be a much more efficient way of doing that. So introducing teachers and then ultimately pupils to these ideas can be really powerful. Likewise, note-taking, some evidence suggests that when we note-take on a keyboard, often because we can type quicker than we can write, we tend to kind of try and write down or type down exactly what a speaker, for example, or a teacher is saying. And that means that we're not really thinking about it. At one point, people thought it was something about, the typing versus the writing, the physicality of it made a difference to how much we remember. But actually, it's because when we write, we can't write that quickly. So we're actually processing and trying to pick out the important points of what a teacher is saying. And that process of thinking hard about what they say before we take notes is what means that we remember it better. Again, if we talk to our pupils about these kinds of things and explain this to them, they can change that. It's not inherent to the technology. We can say, when you're taking notes on a device, don't just write down exactly what I say. Don't just copy the text off the board. You need to summarize that. You need to think about mind maps or other approaches to sort of engaging with that. So that's just a couple of examples, I guess, of the sorts of things we might want to look at. More broadly than technology as well, one thing that's really come out over the last few months is how much of a difference it makes when students have well-developed self-regulation and metacognitive skills in terms of being able to manage work when they're not so directly being monitored by a teacher or a parent. So how do we sort of develop these things in teachers? How do we help our teachers to understand these things and how they can best support their students? We've heard a few of these examples already, so not a huge amount to add here, but of course, things like the EdTech Demonstrator Schools programme are a great support for schools there. At the Chartered College of Teaching, we've delivered and developed two massive open online courses on FutureLearn funded by the Department for Education, which look at evidence-based uses of technology and leadership of technology in schools. Those courses are free and running now. But I think there's also a crucial point that there's something quite powerful in teachers engaging in online learning themselves. We've heard about, of course, the amazing access that the sort of increase in things being online, not face-to-face, has opened up for not just pupils, but teachers in perhaps rural areas. I'm down in Cornwall at the moment. Southwest events tend to be in Bristol. That's 3 hours away. Still not hugely practical for local teachers to be attending. But when things are online, there's a huge opportunity to access those. But more importantly than that, perhaps they're also experiencing what students might be experiencing when they're learning through technology. So we get that kind of experience to reflect on ourselves. And I guess the final point is that because technology is still changing rapidly, and our understanding of what works well in using technology is changing rapidly, that does mean that actually continuing to engage in learning, continuing to engage with the research is really, really crucial if we want to make sure that teachers are always making the best use of technology and supporting their students' digital skills.
Kat, thank you very much. That was fascinating. And I'm just trying to keep up with all the questions that are coming in, making sure I've logged them properly. Nikos, I might come to you first, just with a couple of questions. One is, have you been using at all digital technologies to allow teachers who are in one particular establishment to teach in another setting, or to overcome issues around teacher supply or rurality? The other question I was going to ask you was that you mentioned that your students currently use a variety of devices, and I wondered whether that was a response to, funding pressures or the speed with which the pandemic has descended on us, or whether, as you sort of hinted, do you think it's a better approach to have different applications and platforms and so forth?
If I may start with the first one, we did. And we did this we experimented with this in a couple of different ways. The one was we used the existing, we got all the learners, because what we realized is it doesn't have for the person to be there. So you can do it in a number of different ways, from flipped learning and asynchronous, where you just use it, so that the students can access at any time, and we did that. But also what we did is we experimented by having the teacher initially on the whiteboard as a projection from another classroom where they were teaching their own class, and we had an assistant in the room facilitating the discussion. Where we take that is we worked with another college where they tried to create rooms. And of course, the rooms are made in such a way so that you have multiple screens around them. And you have two similar rooms, a teacher with their own class is one room, and then it is as if the two rooms are linked via a wall. Now, initially, that's at the beginning of the pandemic, that was about 70 grand. And of course, we thought we could do better. So currently, we're experimenting with a room that we created for about 15, and the IT team with the digital teaching team have managed to, and are experimenting with a room for about £5,000. Now, for £5,000, to be able to create rooms that teaching can become interactive with learners in multiple locations, that is a game changer. Because all of a sudden it becomes affordable, not just between our multi-academy trust, but between multi-academy trusts. And then the teacher who is able to bring expertise is not then bound by a particular campus or even a particular region. So bear with us. We think this has massive, massive potential. And would be happy to share the results of our experimentation with colleagues. On the second one, on the variety of devices, we were working on digital delivery prior to the pandemic. And what we wanted to do was to enable the learners, especially because of their rurality and because the learners seem to be glued on their mobile phones, and use it for everything. They were using it to do the homework, they were using to log in. So what we encourage them to do is bring their own device, whatever that device is, in the classroom, and then we experimented with them to use their device to access learning at their own time. The difficulty with that is how do we keep them focused? Because every electronic device they have has multiple uses. So we took this to a group of practitioners. We created an entire program on deep learning to help the students try and focus on a particular task and how long will it take for that task in order for them not to lose focus and to be able to develop it. With the digital learning, also what we found, which was counterintuitive, was that learners that in a classroom wouldn't engage and would be shy found a voice. And they started interacting with the student, with the other students and with the teacher via the chat, or they were able to send homework and have meaningful discussions and take their learning to the next level.
Nikos, thank you. That was fascinating. And we'd certainly like to find out more about the work that you're doing and maybe communicate that to those listening in today as we prepare a paper on some of the conclusions of this afterwards. So yeah, we'll be in touch with you about that. I was going to come briefly to Karen with a couple of questions as well. We have one questioner who said, where people have got one-to-one devices, are these being wholly funded by or provided by the school, or are parents expected to make any contribution? And Karen, it would be really interesting to know, given where you started in many of your schools at the beginning of the pandemic in relation to really poor access to devices and the internet and so forth, how much of that poor access do you think you've already cracked in your schools now? And how much is there still to go to get to the point that you'd like to be at where all children have got really strong access?
Yeah, we've actually funded that through the trust, so that the schools have paid for the devices, because precisely the point that the person made in their comment, we wanted to make sure that there was equity across the piece. Our parents, quite frankly, in a couple of schools could afford it, but in most of our schools they can't. And it's been quite interesting. In some schools, we're having difficulty to persuade some of the parents to take them home because they're worried about taking that responsibility. And we're not forcing that, which we're trying to do that carefully, so that they feel comfortable with it. So that's really important for us, that it is absolutely equitable. Are we where we want to be? Nowhere near. Not yet, because we have had some supply issues. To be honest, we ordered nice new shiny iPads for everybody. There weren't that many around during lockdown. We did get them for the schools that needed them most first, and we prioritised appropriately. They've all arrived now. All the cases are in place. That the children have got them. But the other part that's taken a while is some of our schools haven't got fibre yet to the door, even though we're in Greater Manchester. You'd think we would, but we haven't. So that's an issue. So yeah, there's still quite a long way to go. All the staff have got their devices, and that's been great for teacher workload. It's helped them. Teachers are really on board with this. I noticed somebody's talked about the next step in the vision to include all stakeholders and not just the SLT. We didn't just use the SLT. We did talk to the staff. And the staff have very much powered this because they could see the difficulties. It takes a long time to photocopy all those worksheets for your class. It's a lot easier to send it all out on an iPad. So it has really helped staff workload, and we're looking at creative ways to reduce workload through looking at feedback, etc., and verbal feedback using Seesaw and things like that. So does that answer all of your questions, David?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you very much, Karen. I was also going to come to that question about access to Ethne, because we had a questioner asking about access in Wales and to what extent that issue has now been addressed, particularly given the high levels of poverty that there are in some parts of Wales, as in England, as we've heard. But the questioner was asking how much regional variation in access there appears to be across Wales. And we also had a question early on about whether digital is likely to help more children embrace the Welsh language. So I think those are two for you, Ethne.
Yeah, I think so. I'll go to the second one first, just to be awkward. But yeah, the hub provision has to be bilingual. Every resource that's on there is bilingual. And I think that in its own right gives children exposure to the Welsh language. But we've also had a significant problem over lockdown, where children for whom Welsh is their second language, where neither parent may speak Welsh, there is a resource that has been put onto the platform in order to allow the students to actually hear and learn and work through the Welsh language where they may not get the parental support at home. And that has been a significant issue. So it certainly does help, because I think, we would recognise the fact that a lot of digital resources will come through the medium of English, and learners just seeing it through the medium of Welsh, and Welsh medium learners are able to actually see their own language first and foremost, rather than having to do a translation. So that's the first issue. In terms of the coverage for schools, the Children's Commissioner, I think, did do some research into this, and we're still nowhere near full coverage. I think there was something like 10,000 repurposed machines. There were MiFi devices which were also purchased in order to make sure that kids had internet access, if fibre wasn't available on an individual basis. But you know, there's no way, I don't think we could claim in Wales that we have got this nailed at all. There's a lot more to be done besides, and it is patchy in places, but I think Welsh Government has worked very hard. £92 million has gone into this. We've got just over 500,000 school-aged learners, so we're not looking at anything like the volume of learners, for example, even in Birmingham. So the investment has been considerable and is not just over the COVID period, it has been pre-pandemic as well to support the infrastructure and the curriculum.
Ethne, thank you very much for that. Julia, I was just going to come to you with two quick questions, one of my own and one from the audience. I was really interested to hear that you've taken on more technicians using your apprenticeship levy. I've not heard of schools being able to use the levy all that much, but could you just tell us a bit more about that and whether there were any difficulties that you had to overcome? And then we did have a question about what panelists were doing about online safeguarding, given the big increase in usage of digital, and I wondered whether you'd got anything that you wanted to say about best practice that you've been applying in that area.
Okay, so as far as safeguarding, I'll take that one first. I think Karen has spoken about that as well. I don't know if I've got any examples of best practice aside from the obvious. We take absolutely, you know, safeguarding absolutely as paramount, and we have ensured that all devices have been sort of backed up. All devices that have gone to students the safeguarding procedures are followed ultimately. I think Karen probably answered that one slightly better than me. But as far as the apprenticeship levy is concerned, we've linked with one of our local colleges. So the training is being undertaken through them, and actually it's been fairly straightforward, process. So we're able to interview and bring the apprentices in, offer obviously the training linked to the college and through the school as well. And it's been, touch wood, a fairly seamless process, and we've been really thrilled with the results.
Julia, thanks very much, and that's a good prompt to other people who might also want to take up that idea. So thank you. And then finally coming to Kat. Kat, there might be questions that you've spotted that you wanted to respond to, but I wondered whether in particular you might pick up the challenge that one questioner posed to us about how teachers and schools ensure that tech propositions that are used and applied have a good evidence base, rather than schools being left to themselves to try to sort the good from the less good.
Yeah, I think it's a very fair question, and thanks to Dan for posing that. I think my immediate filter is always if there seems to be a massive overclaim, when I see tools that say, oh, you know, we're going to improve student learning by 150% or something like that, they're probably immediately crossed off my list as either they're lying or they don't know how research and impact works. But I think it's a challenge for sure. One of the challenges obviously is that sometimes if you know, the length of time taken to carry out a kind of robust impact evaluation on how well a tool might work sometimes is so long that actually you'll kind of have missed the point when it might have been useful if you wait for those to have been undertaken. So one thing that I would always look for there is actually even if the tool itself hasn't yet gone through a really thorough evaluation of the effect that it has on student learning, is it built on sound evidence-based principles? You know, if I see something that advertises how it's going to appeal to students' different learning styles, that's probably straight off my list of tools that I'd consider. But at the same time, if it's something that convincingly talks about how it might build in principles from cognitive science, for example, to strengthen students' memorization, that's great. Again, of course, even with that, we have to avoid sometimes people picking up on kind of buzzwords and just throwing them onto their websites, as Dan says, hype AI, blah, blah. We need to try and kind of cut through that to genuinely understand what a tool is doing. I would also cautiously want to be speaking to other schools that are using those tools. I say cautiously because we know that there's a kind of sunk cost bias that goes on, whereby if we've put a lot of money, but also actually just time and investment of human resource into rolling out a tool or making use of particular devices, we kind of want to feel that they've worked, and we can convince ourselves that they have. So it's relatively rare actually to speak to somebody who spent a lot of money on a sort of digital project or a lot of time on this kind of thing and said, actually, probably if we were going to do it, if we were back there again, we wouldn't do that. But of course, it's still always worthwhile to get a sense from people who have used tools to understand how they might be able to help. And I think a point there is also just, as a school, when you're adopting something, really being open to the idea that it might be a pilot, that you want to try it carefully first, and not just assuming that it's naturally going to work, or wanting to feel we've invested in this. Maybe even try a couple of different tools so that you've got a comparison point, rather than just trying one and kind of hoping that that works. But it's a really difficult challenge for sure.
Kat, thank you very much. That was great. Our second and final panel turns to the issue, and admittedly we've touched on this already in some of the contributions, but more away from the issue of access, to look at how digital post-pandemic could help to improve teaching and learning. So how can digital learning improve curriculum delivery in the classroom? What subjects or approaches lend themselves to the use of digital? We did have a panel of 4. Sadly, because of digital access issues, we've lost Lucy. So she does send her very sincere apologies and is fixing that as soon as she can. But Katrina also sadly is unwell today and can't join us. But in spite of that, we've got 2 fantastic speakers, Hardip Begel, the CEO of Woodard Academies Trust, and Bill Watkin, the CEO of the Sixth Form Colleges Association. So Hardip, I'm going to turn to you first. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Firstly, just a bit about the Woodard Academies Trust. It's a geographically dispersed trust with 2 all-through and 4 secondary schools, all the way from Tynemouth down to the south coast. And I suspect it's fairly typical in the pre-pandemic era in having schools at very different stages in their use of technology, and also not having a well-integrated system across the trust. It was great to hear how trusts have moved on this, but we've got a very long way to go as a trust. Most of our provision is very separate and done by schools individually. There's been a lot of public commentary on pupils' learning, so I'm going to focus on teachers. I mean, I feel that the pandemic really opened up continuing professional development opportunities for teachers. So with our sponsor, the Woodard Corporation, we were able to access national and international experts to speak to colleagues through webinars. Now, we get around 1/3 of all teachers in the trust attending the actual webinars, but the real strength lies in the material being available to watch or listen at any time. And mentors can make the material available to new teachers joining the trust in the future. And it's great to see Kat here, because she was actually led one of our Woodard webinars on the science of learning. So in addition to that accessibility, in terms of cost, I mean, we've calculated the webinars are 95% cheaper than the pre-pandemic model of inviting a speaker in person to an inset day at each Woodard school. Now, we don't doubt that face-to-face delivery is important, but I don't think I'm the only person who doesn't miss the travel to conferences and where the questions from the audience are often monologues. And that's what I think we're seeing in this session, that things like the chat function enable many more people to participate and speakers to respond accordingly. When I joined an online CPD session for teachers just last week at one of my schools, on how to minimize pupils' misconceptions. And the trainer made skillful use of questions, the private chat function, and breakout rooms. And it was a real good mix of direct instruction, problem solving, reflection, and checking for understanding. And in many ways, it felt much more efficient than doing it in person, which, given the hours that school staff work, felt like a real bonus and improvement to the way we've done things in the past. I think another advantage is transparency. We had the amazing Christine Council provide 6 hours of training for our senior leaders on the curriculum. Now, we've made all of that material available to all of our teaching staff and non-teaching staff, so they can see what senior leaders have been taught. And I think that's really important in not having training hidden behind closed doors for certain groups of people, but actually just making it open and available for people to see and access. The transparency and accessibility are also at the heart of our approach to sharing curriculum resources within the Trust. I think it's so powerful seeing how peers have approached the same challenges you face and prompting refinements and improvements in your own work. There's also something about knowing that your work will be seen by others that makes you want to up the standard and the quality of it. And the barriers to being curious, a fancy word for nosy, about what's happening in other subject areas are removed through technology. There's no need to go and ask another department for their curriculum folders. It's all just a few clicks away. And that means connections can be made between people and disciplines and individuals who would not have made those in the past. A multi-academy trust should be all about collaboration, and in our trust we've established for the first time networks across our 6 schools in all subjects, which meet once a term virtually. I mean, that means the time commitment is now a couple of hours, not most of a day spent travelling. And it also means that we can have senior leadership input, which wouldn't have happened if they were face-to-face meetings held elsewhere in the country. And I think the technology has really removed some of those barriers to implementing things that we've all wanted to do, but we've not had the time or the money or the energy to do. Now, I think there's definitely a place for school visits, but I think we all need to think much more carefully about what should be done face-to-face versus online. And we really need to put a higher value on our own and colleagues' time. And finally, for me, the pandemic has prompted us to commission a review of our technology, in part due to the increase in cyber attacks in the education sector. So the focus of that review is going to be on exploring how we can save all staff, teaching, non-teaching, service and support staff, how we can save their time through the use of technology, remove low value added tasks. I think Karen mentioned the notorious photocopying of worksheets, but also how we do that in a way that enables us to deliver education and support services much better than we have in the past. So I'm really optimistic, I think, about the use of technology and making sure that we examine the precious time that all of us spend, and with teachers working well over the hours that they're commissioned to do, how do we make sure that we use technology to support a reduction in low value add activities from our colleagues?
Hi, that was great. Thank you very much indeed. And I'll come back with questions on a couple of those things in a moment, if I may. But I turn now to Bill, our other speaker on this panel. Bill.
Thanks, David, and afternoon, everybody. I should explain, I don't have immediate experience of EdTech because I'm not in schools anymore. I spent much of my career in schools, but I now work with sixth form colleges in perhaps a more policy context. But I'll talk a little bit about my own experiences as a learner, my wife's experiences as a teacher, and what I think has been going on in sixth form colleges and what the opportunities are. I've always been struck by the well-known, though anonymous, saying that technology won't replace teachers, but teachers who use technology will probably replace those who don't. And I've been impressed by what Hardip was saying about the CPD opportunities, and others have spoken about it as well. But it does seem to me that the most important step in the journey towards more and better uses of EdTech is a well-structured and properly funded CPD program for users. I remember when in my last school, which was many, many years ago, we introduced a laptops for all teachers program, which was almost unheard of at the time, thinking that when we gave these glossy high-tech instruments to teachers, they would all embrace them and love them. And actually the response was more, have I got to carry this around all the time? And what happens if I drop it? Am I going to have to pay for it? So EdTech today hasn't been embraced with everybody, by everybody, we know that. But there's an awful lot of progress that's been made. We've learned lessons, and it seems to me that the most important thing is to use what we've learned to inform our thinking about what we should preserve and what we should abandon from the last year and before. So clearly COVID's been different, a different experience for both students and teachers. So extrapolating some universal truths will take time. So some students have had better health, better kit, better attitudes, better home environments than others. And some teachers were more skilled, more creative, more comfortable with EdTech than others. But I think most importantly, some schools and colleges were better over the last year at creating a climate, an environment that promoted the development of a new pedagogy. So my wife is a teacher, a traditional classroom teacher, and she taught English and drama to years 7 to 13 throughout the pandemic with fully live lessons, all cameras on, non-stop for months. And she was in the room next door and I could hear it. It was clearly a great success. She was brilliant, but she was utterly exhausted. And by the way, it didn't take long for students to learn how to mess around with other people's cameras, and low-level mischief couldn't be entirely avoided. For myself, last September, I took up beginner Spanish classes at the local adult education college. It was 2 hours on a Saturday morning, 100% target language from a Spanish national with a loud driving voice. And I have to say, I gave up after 4 or 5 weeks. And I had the motivation, a facility with languages, because I was a languages teacher, and an excellent connection in a quiet private home office. So it's hard to imagine what too much EdTech looks like for low-attaining young people with perhaps difficult home circumstances. Sixth form students, with whom I work mostly now, on the whole have had a better experience than many, partly of course because of their attitudes towards learning, their history of academic achievement, and an explicitly taught and practiced, and this is really important, self-regulation in their approach to learning. But even in the sixth form population, some students took to online lessons like ducks to water, while others had difficulty with it. So I asked some students to come up with some comments. One said that online learning felt less personal, and some friends reached out to teachers less, feeling more isolated. One said, I think we've missed out greatly on the classroom conversations and debates that stimulates people's best ideas. One said they were terrible. I couldn't even pay attention. I did all my work, but they're not nearly as useful as real lessons. On the other hand, one said, I found I could ask questions more easily, and as a class, we could all participate more. One said, I actually found I talked to more people within my classes online thanks to the breakout room discussions. But one thing to remember, of course, is EdTech isn't all about formal classroom or workshop learning. For many students coming back to college meant more than reverting to face-to-face teaching. It meant returning to social and working interactions with their peer group, to a program of enrichment and sports, a support network for their mental well-being. Sometimes it just meant the opportunity to get away from home. So when we talk about EdTech, we need to consider not just the taught curriculum, but also the learning that happens in the corridors, the canteens, the study areas, the performing arts spaces, and the playing fields. And we also need to talk about EdTech in the context of students' progression. So whether moving from primary school to secondary school to sixth form college to university or employment, particularly in the context of widening participation. And lots of people have done extraordinary things over the last year to deliver virtual open days, enrollment and induction for various different age groups. And EdTech has played an important part in improving access. It's addressed travel poverty and it's broadened horizons. Interviews have been conducted on a more level playing field. Work experience opportunities, although really difficult to do online, have been available to those who are perhaps less well connected. So we've got to learn from the various delivery models that have been in place. There's been a spectrum, of course, from fully interactive live lessons with all the cameras on, like my wife was doing. I've seen recorded films of teachers teaching from the front. I've seen relatively simple posting of tasks and resources on the intranet. Some safeguarding issues have also been raised this afternoon, and GDPR, parental engagement, often interpreted differently, either freeing up or constraining approaches to teaching and learning. But whatever, EdTech has to work for all students, ensuring that online activity complements, not just replaces, face-to-face interactions, and that digital poverty is not a barrier for any student. I love what Jerry Blumengarten in the US said when he said, tech gives the quietest student a voice. I'll stop there.
Bill, thank you very much for those reflections. And I'll come back to you as well in a moment, if I may. But first, I was going to come to Hardip with a couple of questions, really. Hardip, you emphasized the CPD opportunities and how much cheaper it is also to deliver CPD. Are you confident that once the pandemic is gone in however many months' time, that we won't all slip back to the usual ways? Or do you think on CPD, the change that the pandemic has brought in will be pretty permanent in the way that you access it in your schools? And we also had a question come in while Bill was speaking, which was that you'd spoken quite a lot about CPD and spreading that within trust schools when working together. But the questioner asked whether you were working with other trusts to deliver CPD for your teachers. So I wonder whether you could just touch on those two.
On the first one, I think that it will very much depend on the individuals. People want different things. Some people love having residentials, whole days away with people. Other people want to fit their CPD in often and that fits in with their lives. So I think there'll be a hybrid model where people will be able to choose that. I think the financial pressures on schools will mean that schools will want to push people towards things that are much more cost effective. It's notable that the national professional qualifications are being designed in a way which has switched to moving away from full day courses to learning frequently in small chunks, and the relative costs of that and provision will be online. I think people will have to pay a premium if they want to do the provision, which is more costly. I talked about working within our trust, but most of our schools obviously are well embedded within their communities and their local authority area. So all of our schools will be working either within networks within their authority. Some of our schools take a lead role in their maths hubs, or one of our schools is the National Centre for Computer Education. So they all have existing partnerships and other networks outside the trust where CPD goes on. So I think it's a really important point. And we also, we've got partnerships with other trusts that we will invite people from that trust to join our webinars, and they reciprocate that to us as well. There is a issue, of course, so speakers have to earn their money, and you can't just simply take people's intellectual property, record it, and send their courses off to as many people as possible, or make them open. I think you've got to treat people who are providing CPD with respect and make sure that only a certain number of people have access to it. Otherwise, once it gets out there on the intranet, then it's available for free. It's available for free, and that really does damage some people's business models.
Hardip, thank you very much. Before I turn to Bill, just for the final couple of questions, I was going to put one sort of macro question to you, Hardip, which I'll also ask Bill. Now, I suppose in terms of the long-term benefits of digital learning post-pandemic, it could be all about easier staff training across schools, and you gave heavy emphasis to that. It could, I suppose, be about sharing staff across institutions more easily. It could be about pupil learning within schools, and it could also be about supporting pupils to learn at home. For you, is it very much the staff training element that you think will be the longer term game changer, or was that what you simply chose to focus on today and you think some of those other areas are going to be equally beneficial?
I think that it's difficult to tell at the moment, but I think with adult staff members, the need for a strong relationship with the person who's teaching you or training you is less important than I think it is for young people. And I think that that's why I think I emphasise that technology works particularly well for CPD for teachers. But I'm also very conscious of the workload and the time that teachers have to spend. And so there are different considerations, I think, for teachers CPD than there are for pupils learning.
That's great, thanks. And Bill, final couple of questions to you. I was going to start with that last question I put to Hardit, which is, you know, in 2 or 3 or 4 years' time, when we're looking back on how the pandemic has transformed learning, or if it has, what do you think will be the lasting digital legacy that will really be of benefit to pupils in improving their attainment and progress? And I suppose an associated question, which also came in from one of the audience earlier on, are there any implications here for the way in which we design school and college buildings?
Schoolboy era. I just follow on from what Hardit was saying about CPD for teacher, learning for teachers, not just students, and give an example of a challenge that we're wrestling with at the moment. Typically, we have a 2-day residential conference at a dedicated conference centre in Nottingham every year, every summer, and there are just under 120 sixth form colleges, and we would expect to get about 150 people coming. Tomorrow is the start of our 2-day virtual conference, and we have just under 2,000 people attending. So it makes an enormous difference in terms of how many people can attend, the speakers that you can get, the cost savings, both in terms of accommodation and travel, time away, the opportunity cost of being away from college. And of course, you're stuck there for the whole day once you're there, and you can't dip in and out necessarily. So we're wrestling with what that will look like in 4 or 5 years' time, because half the sector wants to go back to face urgently. They're desperate to. And the other half are very happy not traveling and spending the money and dipping in and out, and most importantly, making the opportunity available to all the senior leaders, all the middle leaders, anyone for whom it's of interest and value. And it's exactly the same for students, I think. You know, there are opportunities, we've heard this afternoon about opportunities to bring in outstanding speakers, employers, people who can provide mental health support. There's a whole host of reasons why online learning is going to be with us in many, many different ways, I'm sure. In terms of building design, it's not my big thing, but I can only say I'm concerned that it took an awfully long time to roll out enough kit this year. That kit has got to be maintained, upgraded as time goes on. We can't just rely on what was distributed over the last year. And I think rather than buildings, I would say my concern is about kit and making everything available to everybody.
And Bill, that's a prompter for a very, very final question from me. And then I promise I'll stop lobbing questions at all of you. So far, I suppose we've delivered a lot of kit and digital support to schools in different ways, school to school. And we've almost assumed that it's a school level choice, or sometimes even a family level choice, to access technology and to pay for some of it. Has that model pretty much survived the test of the pandemic, or are we going to need to have a far more national approach to provision in the future, where there's an assumption of a minimum entitlement which is funded by the DfE, however unenthusiastic they may be about such a proposition at the current time?
Well, I'm neither the first nor the only person to say that it seems to me that laptops will become as commonplace as textbooks have been, and will almost certainly replace textbooks in many situations. We have an expectation that schools and colleges will provide the textbooks, and I think we're developing an expectation that they will provide the hardware as well.
Thank you very much. We've come to the end of our two panels, so I just wanted to thank all of the speakers. I really enjoyed listening to the debate, and there were lots of very earthy practical points that we heard that I think listeners will have found very interesting and may want to pick up in their own schools, as well as some interesting policy steers for the future. So thanks to all of the panelists, and thanks to all of those who have listened in today and lobbed their questions in. Thanks also to Apple again for supporting the event. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we will be preparing an overview paper of some of the points that have come out of the last few webinars that we've held, and we hope to publish that later in July, which will be a resource to many people who have listened in but are interested in following up on some of the ideas that have been discussed over the last few months. So thank you all very much, and look out for that paper when we put it online next month. Thank you all.
Thank you.